Hello, everyone. If those of you in back could take seats, delighted that you're here. Welcome to the Mark Palmer Forum for the Advancement of Democracy, our annual conference. It's my honor to introduce Senator Ben Cardin, who's the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Cardin received Freedom House's Leadership Award in 2013, and he has a long and distinguished career as a human rights champion. He's the lead author of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which is working its way through Congress, and we're trying to help. He's championed the prioritization of combating corruption, promoting democracy, and protecting human rights in U.S. foreign policy. We're really grateful that he's joined us today in the midst of a rather busy Senate schedule. Senator Cardin. forum dedicated to the late Mark Palmer. This is Mark Palmer here. This conference room is, in fact, also named after him. He was U.S. ambassador to Hungary in 1989, and he took the initiative to identify with civil society and the Hungarian democratic opposition to support a transition as the Cold War was coming to a close. In fact, if you're in the rear of the room, I urge you to see a picture of Mark Palmer, who I miss dearly, in the streets with activists for democracy in Hungary. Subsequent to Mark Palmer's work as Hungary, he devoted himself to effectively supporting and promoting democratic transitions all around the world. We're really delighted that Dr. Sushma Palmer has partnered with us here at Freedom House to carry on his legacy through this forum. We just heard from Senator Cardin about the importance of grappling with human rights, with corruption, with governance democratic and good. And that embodies what we're here to discuss today. U.S. foreign policy in supporting democracy abroad, increased repression in China and what can be done to respond, the importance of promoting and protecting free speech and expression, and finally, new opportunities and innovation for change driven by citizen activism. Freedom House is celebrating its 75 years of defending democracy and promoting freedom. And one important aspect of that work is supporting civil society activists and human rights defenders on the ground. Some of them will be on that last panel. I'd like to share a video we created that highlights two of our partners who, in the face of injustice, have fought back and called for freedom and human rights in their countries.
Most of my generation grew up under dictatorship. People were jailed for discussing politics. People used to get shot for protesting. People disappeared for protesting. So we grew up in a culture of fear. As a photographer working for one of the biggest papers in Nairobi, my work was to document what was going on in the country. I was traumatized from seeing the violence and taking pictures of that. Said I can't just be the guy who takes pictures, then moves on. I said, yeah, I can't be that silent witness. So I quit my job, and that began my journey into activism.
At 18 years old, I decided to go to a convent because I thought that was the only way to help people. But when I was preparing for my final vows, I have a doubt. I don't want to be in a black habit. It doesn't help people. It doesn't say anything to people. So I came out. And I started thinking that perhaps working for human rights could be an answer to try to be a real sister to everyone. That's why I'm here.
Kenya right now has a new constitution that allows me to picket, protest, demonstrate. But the police still have that dictatorship mentality. I have a mark on my face where I got beat up by a cop for asking the question, why? And this year alone, Kenya police has shot dead 13 people in peaceful protest.
Esta sentencia confirma que es posible juzgar a militares del fuero civil. Ay, qué bueno, pues felicidades a todos. Los de jurídico han de estar bien contentos.
Sí, sí.
Este momento para nosotros es muy importante porque es la primera que un juez civil sanciona a una autoridad militar. Since 2009, we started receiving reports of people disappeared. Their families were taken by the authorities, by militaries, by the police. Since then, 1,299 persons disappeared. One of the objectives of the disappearances is to cause terror, frighten people. So we decided that we have to do something for that.
So how do you stop injustice? You fight back. You fight back. and you fight back. Courage is doing something and knowing that there will be consequence, but you're willing to pay the price. Courage is when every single nerve in the body is telling you, sit down, shut up, and you stand up and shout. In every protest that we do, we always strive to be as visual as we can be, because we know people don't forget images, people don't forget color, people don't forget sound. People talk about it, and that means that the message goes beyond the city where we do the protest. The whole country gets to hear about it, and the world gets to know about it. We are crazy enough to think that through art you can change our community and change our world.
Tienes a tu alrededor gente por la que hay que luchar. Con cualquiera de ellos o de ellas te van a decir, mira, yo también viví estos momentos. What we offer families of the people who were disappeared is to come to a meeting every week where families with the same situations help each other.
Aquí está toda la lista,
And we start accompany them to go to the authority and to tell them, look, this happened to me, so you have to do something. 1,299 persons disappeared. We have found 51 alive and 71 by DNA. Freedom House is helping us to empower people in democracy values, so that people discover that they are the power of their own rights. If we get that, we did it.
When I began, I was alone, but along the way, people joined me. The bigger the community, the bigger the impact, because when you have numbers, you have people power. Freedom House is a necessary voice to human rights defenders, and they've been very supportive in our work.
I do believe that simple people like me and like you can do the change.
You're free. That sounds very nice. Freedom. Free. It's a good feeling to be free.
I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I'd like to ask the members of our first panel to come join us so we can talk about the difficulties and the importance of promoting democracy in U.S. foreign policy.
I'm supposed to... Hello, everybody. I'm Jackson Deal of the Washington Post, and I'm very pleased to be here to moderate our discussion this morning, which is about U.S. policy in promoting democracy and human rights and what we have to look forward to with the next administration. I'm particularly glad to be part of a forum named after Mark Palmer. Mark Palmer was a friend of mine. I first met him when he was ambassador to Hungary in the 1980s and was struck immediately by the fact that practically alone among diplomats in communist-ruled Europe at that time, he got it. He got it that the system couldn't survive and he had allied himself already well before 1989 with the forces that were trying to change it. And for decades after that, I was always so impressed by not only his passion for promoting democracy, but his original thinking about how we could do it. And so I think that's a good model for us today. I think we're going to get some original thinking about how we can promote democracy. We've got an outstanding panel here. You have their biographies, but just briefly, Richard Fontaine is the president of the Center for a New American Security. He served as a senior advisor and senior fellow at CNAS from 2009 to 2012. He's also been a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and he's worked at the State Department and the National Security Council. Shannon Green, our second panelist, is director and senior fellow of the Human Rights Initiative at CSIS, and she's recently left the administration after six years or so of working at the Agency for International Development and the National Security Council on human rights issues. And Suzanne Nossel is executive director of the PEN American Center, She was previously worked at Amnesty International USA, at Human Rights Watch, and she has worked at the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. So we're going to plunge right into questions. I'm going to start by asking each one of them a question and invite the others to join in. And in the meantime, I believe cards are going to be, if you have a question, you can write it down on a note card and it'll be passed up. And I'll be asking them some of those questions as well. So just to begin with, I think as a starting point, Richard, let me start with you. What is the next administration going to be starting from? Where do democracy and human rights currently fall as priorities of U.S. policy? And what is going to be the Obama legacy to the next president in handling those issues?
Well, thanks, Jackson. And before I answer, just let me also say what an honor it is to be associated with something that is in the name of Ambassador Mark Palmer. I didn't know him well, but I had the chance to work with him about 10 years ago when I was working for Senator McCain, and he came up with ideas for what ultimately became the Advanced Democracy Act. And he had many more ideas than the Congress was willing to pass, but even those that they did pass all came from him. And so he was truly an extraordinary individual. And of course, another ambassador, Mark Lagon, deserves gratitude from all of us for having spent his career dedicated to the cause of human rights and democracy. I think the next administration is going to have some digging out to do, both because of the global environment for democracy and human rights, which, as Freedom House's reports indicate, has been in a decline now for nearly a decade around the world. And so the challenge is greater now than it has been in some time. And it seems to me that the administration, over the course of its 2 terms, has deprioritized human rights as an element of its foreign policy. Certainly when the president came in, his aspirations and his stated goals to support the cause of human rights and democracy around the world were very high. And programmatically, although democracy funding has declined, many of those things are in place. But if you look at it, it's hard to think, for example, of a country right now with which we have a critical relationship that also has human rights as the number 1, the number 2, or the number 3 issue. And I think that really matters because certainly human rights is always on the table somewhere. But our friends in places like Egypt and Bahrain and China and Russia, and take your pick, they know the distinction when it comes to dealing with the United States if human rights is at or near the top of the agenda, or if it's number 15 or 16 after you get through all of the other items, and it's sort of a talking point that's put in the last part of the memo for somebody to mention so you can check the box. And I think part of that stems from a sense that however important and however desirable promoting human rights and democracy might be, we just aren't very effective in doing it, which I also think is a mistake to conclude. And so I think there's both a deficit in the understanding about what the right tools are and how we go about doing this, but also the importance of this issue in foreign policy that the next administration should take up.
Other thoughts?
I think that the assessment's a little harsh. If you take Burma, for example, that's a country that immediately leaps to mind where I would say human rights is at the top of the agenda. And we've seen substantial progress, and it's partly because of the administration's approach of combining pressure and engagement. I do agree there's a real kind of struggle underway about kind of how you do this effectively, and we have seen, I know we'll talk about, a concerted backlash against some of the tools and approaches that have been used over the last couple of decades. And I think there is a kind of groping process that's underway and that needs to be accelerated to drive toward tools that can be effective in light of some of the pushback and the very determined efforts of certain governments to make it difficult, if not impossible, for the U.S. to support local activists and local civil society groups, and the sense that on the public stage, when the U.S. is pushing overtly, that is a kind of a form of pressure that, while traditionally effective, really can cut the other way now. And there's a lot of support for the idea that governments, don't need to accede to that kind of very overt pressure. And so I think I think for the next administration, the key is to, not out of a reflective sense that we need to do more necessarily revert to the old tools, but really think hard about kind of how we do this now.
So I think it's actually a mixed bag. I agree with both of you, but one way of threading the needle is to think about the hard cases versus the cases where we're pushing against an open door. I think the administration has taken advantage of opportunities like in Burma or Sri Lanka or elsewhere where there was sort of an indigenous movement towards democracy, and the costs of supporting it weren't high in terms of having to compromise on other priorities. But I think it's in the hard cases like Egypt or Russia or Pakistan where a lot of the criticism comes from, because there are 15 priorities that come before democracy and human rights. And those are the examples that really stick in our minds in terms of what the administration has and has not done. I think topically, there are a few things that the administration has done that I hope whoever comes, into the White House carries on. For example, there has been a real elevation of support for civil society and the Stand with Civil Society agenda. That is very much on the map. It's on the global agenda because the administration made it a priority. LGBT rights have been something that the administration has spent a lot of time and effort elevating, to mixed effect, but I still think it's important that we're, out there saying that, LGBT rights are human rights, and same thing for women's rights. So I think there are a couple areas where there has been a lot of progress. You could look at the Open Government Partnership, but then other areas, particularly in the really hard cases, where we do have a lot of digging out to do.
Civil society has already come up a couple of times, and I want to plunge into that topic because it's one of the main tools the United States has used for the last 30 years to promote democracy and human rights. We fund human rights groups. We fund groups that promote fair elections. And it's, there were some really big successes with that, especially in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and other places. But, the other side has figured this out, and now there's been this terrific backlash, as Suzanne mentioned. Russia, China, Egypt, all waging campaigns basically to wipe out any group backed by the United States of any stripe whatsoever. And they're being imitated by countries all over the world now. So what's our reaction to that reaction?
Yeah, there are more than 50 countries around the world that have passed restrictive NGO laws with registration requirements, bans or constraints on foreign funding, shutting down or blocking out organizations. Freedom House obviously was, in the vortex of this in Egypt, but also elsewhere in the world. It's really complicated the efforts of groups, including my own, PEN America, to do the work that we do supporting some of the PEN centers around the world, because they've become much more focused on sort of where the money is coming from, whether it's going to impose any new requirements or vulnerabilities for them. And it's forced many organizations and foundations to really begin to rethink how they're doing their work. There was, I think, a very positive trend over the last 15 years in the foundation world and in terms of government funding of wanting to push money out, not to the big Western organizations, but really reach beyond that to these local civil societies, actors on the ground that are on the front lines of social change and have the credibility domestically. And, this is what we're now seeing, that governments, whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, Venezuela, Uganda, even Israel becoming, and other democracies becoming very concerned about this external impact and what influence it's having. The other piece of it that's particularly worrying is domestically in many of these countries, there is popular opposition to civil society that is being stoked, whether it's on grounds of xenophobia, homophobia, anti-colonialism, but all these different sort of strains that can be used to rouse popular opposition to civil society. So I think it's a really serious challenge. I think, there's a series of things that the next administration needs to think about in terms of how to deal with it. One is multilateralizing our democracy and human rights promotion efforts. The U.S. hand, while I completely agree with Senator Cardin that if we don't lead, so often no one else will. I think he also made the important point that in the anti-corruption sphere, we've been able to get other people, other countries on board to support this. And I think it has to be a group that includes also non-Western actors. And there are some that are involved in this space in a small way, and I think they'll be involved in a bigger way. There are also some arms of the UN system that are involved, whether it's the UN's Democracy Fund or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that are seen as kind of credible, relatively credible global institutions that sort of don't have that hand of a Western government directly getting involved. I also think we need to define civil society more broadly and think about how to support a wider range of, whether it's cultural institutions, professional associations, other kinds of groups that are less subject to these, the kind of critique that these governments are mounting. And then I guess the final strategy that I would point to is looking at kind of horizontal networks of civil society actors that operate around the world, whether it is scientific associations or bar associations, and how we can fortify them so that they can strengthen their networks. And it's not the U.S. necessarily working directly with a foreign actor in a country where that could make them a target, but it's rather a global institution with a stronger hand that sort of lifts up all of its entities.
Richard, should we think about going back to clandestine funding for groups like this? And that was a big thing in the Cold War, and some of it was rather effective. We had the AFL-CIO routing money to Solidarity in Poland, for example, quite effectively. Is it worth thinking about that sort of thing again?
Yeah, the problem is how poor we are at keeping things clandestine these days. And so I would worry that we could do that for a relatively short period of time, and then it would all blow up and be worse than if we had never started in the first place, because it would taint all of the recipients of that aid. And it would actually reinforce the paranoia that all of these civil society groups are in fact funded by the CIA, designed to foment color revolutions in their countries and actually produce a crackdown greater than what have otherwise been the case. So as attractive as that may be in the abstract, in the real world of today's media, I think that's sort of a dangerous path to go down. I do, though, agree that to the extent to which we can work with new non-Western partners behind this effort, that is a fruitful path. So India is an example of, India has always done some kind of democracy type work, but in a very circumscribed way, and it also sort of touts its non-interference and all these other kinds of things. But if you add up all the things that it has done over the years and its capacity, it's a kind of a country that could be a meaningful partner with the United States, or even in parallel to these kinds of efforts. And so, it's not a perfect answer by any means to the challenge that you're describing, but I think, as you said, it's one answer.
I wanted to build on something that Suzanne said, because since I've left the government, I've been doing a lot of research on closing space for civil society and interviewed civil society actors from many different countries. And I've really been astounded by the degree to which there's a lot of anger and frustration out there with sort of the normal paradigms of support for civil society. So what I've picked up in these conversations is that these organizations are really looking for a different kind of partnership, whether it be with the US government or other donors, private and public. They feel like they're spending the majority of their time, filling out paperwork for the donor, that they don't have the bandwidth to engage and build constituencies that they need to overcome that paranoia or that sense that, maybe, these organizations are doing something nefarious. And they feel like they're not trusted by their donors. So I would say, number one, and this is a direction that some foundations are moving in, we do need to be looking at more core funding, investing in organizations for the sake of those organizations, not just for projects. And two, we need to be really creative in thinking about how we can support different organizational forms. So in some of these environments where the government has really cracked down on civil society, civil society actors are adopting different kinds of organizational forms to carry on that work, whether that be registering as a civil company or as a social enterprise, or just kind of staying loosely affiliated as a movement or as a civic group. So we need to be much more nimble in being able to support those kind of efforts, and not merely being able to provide resources, support, and training to organizations that are formal, that have a board, that are able to write grant applications and have all the audit regimes in place.
It kind of takes me to my next question. I mean, we've got a lot of government experience sitting up here, so I really want to go ahead and plunge into the bureaucratic weeds and ask, is the U.S. government properly set up institutionally to really address these issues and to carry out these kinds of things? Shannon, have you got thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for the most part, no, unfortunately, and this is something that Senator Cardin alluded to as well as Richard, which is oftentimes decisions are made in a really bifurcated manner. So you have decisions about counterterrorism cooperation or security cooperation over here, and then you have conversations and decisions being made about, political issues, human rights and democracy issues. And oftentimes those things are very much in tension with each other. And I think we need to have a system and a process at the NSC that helps reconcile those issues and really accepts the premise that decisions made about security, cooperation, who we partner with, what kinds of training, equipment, and other support we provide is inherently a political decision because it's going to empower certain actors in that society. It's going to bolster certain institutions. And so we really need to be thinking about the impact on democracy and human rights when we're making those decisions. I personally would favor going to a situation in the NSC where we have somebody at a very senior level who's responsible for democracy and human rights. Right now, democracy is in one part of the NSC, human rights is in another. I would like to see somebody at the Deputy National Security level be responsible for that so that they can really sort of sit at the table in deputies committee meetings and make sure that there is this reconciliation of priorities. At state, USAID, and elsewhere, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, as it were, and I still think that there could be much more unity of effort. There are programmatic offices at USAID, several at the State Department, and elsewhere that are doing similar types of activities in the democracy and human rights space, and I would like to see there be some greater division of labor so that people can focus on having an impact and not sort of fighting over resources and attention. And then the third thing, and this is something that Senator Cardin talked about, and it's very appropriate that we're sitting in the Mark Palmer room, is that I think incentives need to be put in place for ambassadors to really elevate democracy and human rights issues on their agenda. There's always this predisposition to just maintaining the status quo. The stability of the relationship is seen as like the preeminent responsibility. And no ambassador wants to be the one that presides over a destabilization in the relationship. And therefore, sort of the risks of pushing an agenda where democracy and human rights is at the forefront isn't really respected or honored or encouraged, I think, at the State Department. So there does need to be some greater appreciation and rewards and encouragement and incentivizing of people taking those kinds of risks.
I mean, I just add, I agree with all of that, but most of that was done in the second Bush term, and then not done again. So there was a deputy national security advisor who had responsibility for democracy promotion. The undersecretary of state was renamed to given responsibility for democracy promotion. Transformational diplomacy was added as an element to the employee evaluations for all foreign service officers who were posted abroad. Transformational diplomacy had to come back in all of the mission performance plans and bureau performance. And now we're getting really weedy. But I mean, the point is all this was sort of baked in, and then it sort of all went away with the change of administration. There's some things that you can do, and I agree, especially on the incentive side, to make people believe that they have a bureaucratic or a career interest in being active in this field. So, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor can't really help people get jobs that they might want in embassies abroad, but regional bureaus can, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, there has to be the signal from the top down that this is of importance to the policymakers. And if you don't have that, then no amount of coordination and bureaucratic incentives is going to really do a whole lot.
Just to say, I think there was a need at the beginning of the Obama administration, for some of the sort of residue of Iraq experience to kind of wash out of the system, and the democracy promotion agenda that had dominated during the Bush years, was, I think it became sort of a focal point of what had gone wrong in American foreign policy. And democracy promotion got a bad name during that period. And it has, I think it fed the backlash that we've talked about, but it also fed a sort of bureaucratic unease and a sense of confusion about, where does this stand? How do we pursue this? Is this, a positive or a negative thing? And I think we have some distance from that now, and there is an opportunity to try to reinvigorate kind of bureaucratically how this is taken more seriously. I really agree with Richard that it has to come from the top, because ultimately you're going to have, no matter how you configure the table, there's going to be sort of a human rights and democracy advocate at that table, and there'll be other people at that table. And, that a lot depends on, how well armed that person is, with their arguments, and how well able they are to frame their issues and goals in ways that are going to resonate with whether it's a regional bureau or somebody who has oversight over counterterrorism or whatever it may be. But, in the end, it's sort of the decision maker who has to reconcile those competing imperatives. And so I think, both at the White House and at the State Department, having that compass that really is oriented in this direction is going to be essential.
Shannon mentioned that there, as part of this sort of mixed record, there's some digging out to do with the hard cases. And of course, there's a lot of them. But I wanted to bring up a couple in particular because I just think they're so striking in what's happened in the last few years. And that's Egypt and Turkey. These are two countries that, in 2009, seemed like they were headed in more or less the right direction when it came to democracy and human rights, partly in the case of Egypt because of pressure from the Bush administration. And now, in 2016, both of them seem to be at possibly the worst points in their modern history in terms of their records on these issues. And the Obama administration's approach to that is basically to be silent. I was very struck the other day that Obama had a meeting with Erdogan in which he profusely, expressed his gratitude that Erdogan had survived the coup and promised to do everything possible to help him get to the perpetrators, and on, not a word about the 70,000 people who have been rounded up since then. So I guess my question is, we obviously have very complex relationships with these countries. We have big equities, national interest equities. Is there an adjustment that can reasonably be made by the next administration? If so, what would that be?
Are you up on deck?
Want to start with Shannon?
Yeah, go ahead and then I'll jump in.
Well, so I'm reading Shadi Hamid's book right now, Islamic Exceptionalism, and I've been really taken in some ways by the argument that he's made, which is essentially that there's a really complicated, long history in the Middle East of mixing religion and governance, and that it's going to be very difficult to disentangle these for a number of historical, theological, and cultural reasons, which is not to say that we shouldn't be promoting universal human rights in the region, but it is to say that there's contestation in terms of how to think about the role of religion and governance. And I think where we are, particularly in Egypt, I'm not as much of a student of Turkey, is that we're in a situation where there's a perception that liberal democracy failed, that political Islam failed, that experiments with Arab nationalism failed. And so now we're back in a sort of predicament where you either have a strong military state that says that it can keep people safe, or the alternative of violent extremist organizations who espouse their ideology. I think to get out of this situation, the United States, the next administration, needs to really think about how to support actors who are trying to reconcile the role of Islam in governance and are dealing with that contestation, and recognizing that it might take different forms than we have in the United States or in other Western countries, but ultimately needs to respect the human rights of all the citizens that live in that country. So I'm in a place where I think some sort of quiet support to help people sort of work through what those institutional forms would look like would be a helpful next step, so that we're not caught in this binary between, strong state or terrorism, and that there is a third way.
I think Turkey is a harder case than Egypt because we rely on Turkey to fly missions out of Incirlik Air Force Base and for the train and equip program in Syria. They're a NATO ally, all of these kinds of things. But I do think that we should at least have our public and private position clear that however unattractive a coup may be to everyone, the kind of reaction that we've seen in Turkey is completely disproportionate and over time is going to lead to lots of bad outcomes for Turkey, certainly, but possibly for the United States. With Egypt, I actually think we have far less equities today. I mean, Egypt used to be the most important Arab country and all of these other things. It just doesn't play a huge role in the geopolitics of the Middle East the way it once did. And in fact, by having brought forth the Sisi regime that is far more repressive than the Mubarak regime, now all the eggs are in the basket of Sisi can hold on to the stability of that society through repression alone and do it forever. And we have signed up to that as well. And that's all works fine until it doesn't, and then it cracks open. And if you look at already the number of terrorist attacks in Sinai and elsewhere in Egypt, there's a huge disjuncture where it spiked after Sisi took over and the crackdown began. And, you know, rounding up Muslim Brotherhood people is sort of one thing. Rounding up every university student and, you know, all these other things is quite another. So I think we should do far more to condition our aid on specific reforms in Egypt. The $1 billion we give is supposed to generate leverage. I don't see how we've actually used that leverage to achieve anything with Egypt. And, you know, the counter argument is, well, you know, the Emiratis will give them billions and the Saudis will give them, fine. I mean, if they truly don't want the aid, it's hard to see how we would take $1 billion in taxpayer money and give it to Egypt, be extremely uncomfortable with what they're doing, both from a values and an interest perspective, and achieve nothing in the balance.
Just briefly, a couple of things. One thing I think could be done is just being more consistent in speaking out and kind of always speak out. And so it's, you know, it's just understood. If he's meeting with Erdogan, you know, he must bring this up. Like, it can't not be done because it's done every single time. It's done every single time with the Chinese. It was just part of our DNA. You know, it's always on you know, the page of the talking points that gets used. Because I think then, you know, you could say, and Richard mentioned this, and it's valid that, you know, it can become rote, and there is that danger. But I still think it's better to err on the side of consistently bringing it up. And if you have that consistency, it's sort of not a big debate every single time that has to be scrutinized. You know, both you know, the White House and the foreign leadership know that the point is going to be raised. You know, I think the other piece is you sort of have to look at a couple of levels. But there's our own integrity. There's how sort of the dissidents on the ground in these countries feel about the role we're playing. And then there's whether we can actually influence the policy and the measures used by these regimes. And, you know, number 3 is really hard, but I think we can do better on 1 and 2.
To Suzanne's point, I think it also matters who says it. So if it's the DAS from DRL, who's always the one who's raising the democracy and human rights points, the Egyptian regime or in Turkey, they're like, yeah, we're able to disregard that person. If the Secretary of Defense, if the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if the President, if the Vice President, if people who are not expected to carry the water on democracy and human rights issues send that message, I think it can carry more of an impact, because then it seems like, okay, wait a minute, this is actually serious. This isn't just the person who's responsible for this portfolio telling us that this is important.
You know, it strikes me that another thing that has changed, and if not in the last 8 years, then certainly in the last 15 years, is that we're no longer in a world where it appears that we're at the end of history and the only proper model out there is liberal democracy, and everybody is gradually headed in that direction. We now have sort of an alternative model that is developed by China, Russia, Iran, and that when other countries look at it, seems to be working for them. And so it's kind of a rival now. And so I guess one question I have is, to what extent should we be combating that model, trying to explain why it's wrong, tear it down, or do we sort of take the Obama approach that, well, it's doomed by history, and so that will take care of itself?
I think we should not leave the information space uncontested, both as a government, but also as a society. I mean, there's a limit to the government should be in this business, but there's a limit to how much the government can convince foreign societies that, democracy is the best model when you have, the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, sort of thing going on, all this other stuff. I think this is also a mission for our society at large. And it's a mission for the very reason you said, which is we didn't have to do this for a long time. We didn't have this big battle of ideas. But you look what the Russians are doing in democracies in Western Europe, teaming up with civil society, so-called civil society groups, to push out a message about the attractions of this vague kind of conservative autocracy, teaming up with right-wing parties across Europe. I spent 2 months of this summer in Australia, and China has a major soft power kind of push going on in the universities, in buying supplements in the newspapers, and it's trying to take off first, the criticism of anything in Chinese foreign policy, but to elevate the idea that, what the Chinese political model is also a legitimate way forward. And I think most Americans don't think that an autocracy that rules without the will and consent of its people is a legitimate way. And I think we need to make the case for why democracy is better.
So I absolutely agree that we need to contest it and push back, because I think one of the things that has led to this sort of snowball effect or acceleration is that countries see countries getting away with it when they're passing laws that crack down on civil society, when they're passing CT laws that criminalize, free protest, all sorts of these kinds of activities. When they see China and Russia and Egypt and Turkey and Hungary either getting away with it or just merely sort of getting a slap on the wrist, they conclude that there will be few consequences for them if they go down the same route. And for the most part, they've been right. Countries are serving on the Security Council, they're serving on the Human Rights Council, they're part of trade negotiations, all sorts of things. They're, having high-level dialogues with senior officials in the U.S. government with little consequence for their behavior and for their disregard for democracy and human rights. So, yeah, I think, pushing back, speaking out consistently is important to dissuade other countries from jumping on the bandwagon.
Yeah, I think this is a key piece. I think it's a real danger of a sort of rollback, even in the West. I mean, you talk about Australia, but the same is happening here with 400 Confucius centers on U.S. college campuses and a huge infusion of Chinese students who are all paying full freight with the support of the government. And it can be a great thing, depending on what their experience is here and what happens when they go back to China. But I think we are only just waking up to the ways in which, when it's China and Russia are exporting, their brand of authoritarian rule, and the copycat NGO laws is one example of it. And I think kind of there's a defense that needs to be played that is new. And I think, whether it's the U.S. government or the foundations that invest in these areas, I think they have not yet woken up to how it is that we, the need to look at our own institutions and make sure that we are girded against rollback. And, at Penn, we've looked at a couple of arenas. We've looked at the Chinese censorship of Western books when they are translated into Chinese for publication in Mandarin. They get censored, and the publishers have been going along with that. We're doing a report that we're just finishing right now about Western news organizations and the compromises that they have to make in order to cover China. And they're kind of all the it's I would say at this stage, it's just kind of a creeping compromise that is going on in some of these areas, but it has a lot of potential to expand. And obviously, the internet companies are another crucial arena there, where there's a tremendous dilemma in terms of wanting access to these markets and the kinds of compromises that they're having to make.
I have a question from the audience that says, what are the current opportunities to make democracy support more multilateral? And this was touched on before, but I wonder if we could be a little bit more specific. How about the UN Human Rights Council? I mean, the U.S. is supposed to go back on that next year, apparently. I mean, is there any hope for it? And is it a vehicle we can use? Or are there other multilateral opportunities?
Over here.
Shan's starting to laugh. So, I feel I have to step in because I worked on the Human Rights Council during the first few years of the Obama administration when the U.S. took its seat for the first time. I think it's exceeded expectations in a lot of areas, and just to cite a few, North Korea, where there was a hugely influential report, the first kind of real global report, documenting the breadth of the abuses, and a Security Council consensus resolution about that report, now an accountability panel that's going to report back, documenting the commissions of inquiry on Libya, on Syria, on Sri Lanka. By the time when we first joined, there were no country resolutions at the council, and people thought, even advocates here in Washington thought, well, don't try to do country resolutions, because it's just going to be Israel. Stay away from countries, just do themes like women's rights or, other kinds of issues. So that's really changed. And I think that, from a fact-finding perspective, I think the council's work with these commissions has been critical. That said, there are no-go areas, and the no-go areas are such important countries: China, Russia, Egypt. And that's not the council. That's geopolitics. That's the council's just for these global dynamics that at this stage dictate that a majority of countries in the UN system and most countries in the developing world are not going to back any kind of forceful criticism of the Chinese or the Russians or the Egyptians in a multilateral arena. And there's been some softening on that. Now there's a statement about Chinese human rights. It's very weak, and it's a small group of countries that are participating. So I think you have to sort of see it where it's useful. What I'm struck by is, with all of this fact-finding, the ability to sort of go to the next stage and really enforce accountability, in some cases through the ICC. There's some instances where I think that's made a difference, but it's sort of a narrow needle to thread, and there are a lot of hurdles to using that route. There aren't a lot of other routes to follow up on these, the meticulous documentation that is going on. But I think everybody in the human rights field knows how important that documentation and fact-finding and expose function is, so I wouldn't discount it.
So on that note, when I have been interviewing civil society activists globally, the one thing they often point to in terms of something that's been very helpful is the universal periodic review process, because everybody has to go through it, and at least there's a public airing of some of the shortcomings in their countries. And so, I think that's important. In terms of other multilateral fora, when I was in the administration, spent a lot of time trying to think about how we could sort of reinvigorate the community of democracies and really make that a place where democratic countries would come together, would pursue joint sort of policies, particularly on the issue of closing space, and would act together sort of as a coherent unit. And the reason I think that's so important is because, as we've all discussed, authoritarian countries are banding together. They are learning from each other. They are working together to push back on democratic norms and principles. And so we need to be sort of equally united. I know Bobby, Doug, and others have spent a lot of time trying to get the community of democracies there. I think we're not there yet. It's still an imperfect institution, but right now it's the best that we have in terms of a place where democracies can come together and think about how to address the rollback in rights that we're seeing.
I've got a sort of provocative question here back on this topic of civil society, and it actually touches a little bit on something you said, Shannon. It says, we've seen the emergence of an NGO-cracy in Eastern Europe after mass movements and revolutions, a class of professionals dependent on foreign funding and disconnected from the needs and wants of the population. These donor-driven NGOs have fueled resentment from the population and failed to create democratic change because they are not rooted in the population. Is this something the U.S. government is actively trying to tackle to ensure the groups it supports are legitimately representing popular needs? Is this a fair criticism?
That is definitely a widespread criticism. So in our research on closing space, that's one of the factors that we have concluded is contributing or exacerbating closing space, is the fact that a lot of NGOs, particularly in the human rights space, haven't done enough to build constituencies and to get the population on board and to understand what value they add. their society. So you definitely hear a lot of that when you travel. In terms of whether the US government is doing enough to combat that, I mean, I think there have been some efforts to broaden the types of organizations that USAID and other parts of the USG work with. So for example, in Egypt, right after the Arab Spring, there was this APS with $50 million or so dollars. And in order to reach a different set of organizations, particularly those that were playing a leading role in the Arab Spring at the time, the USAID mission went throughout the country. They basically had a caravan, and they went throughout the country, and they talked about the APS opportunity. They worked with smaller organizations that had never received USG funding before, in terms of how to write a successful application. So there was a real effort to get the word out, and that's not the only example. So there have been some efforts to channel money to more grassroots organizations, but again, it's difficult for the reasons I mentioned earlier. At the end of the day, the US government is accountable to taxpayers' money, and they have to make sure that there's no siphoning off of money. They need to make sure that there are results that can be measured and quantified. That's a key demand that we often hear from OMB and the Hill. And they need to make sure that these organizations really have the capacity to do the work. And oftentimes that sort of cuts against engaging new, smaller kinds of partners. So I think it needs to be a priority for the next administration, and there have been, small steps in that direction.
Back to hard cases, we have a question here about the Philippines. The president was elected on an anti-corruption platform. Now there are mass killings. But at the same time, he's a key U.S. ally at a time of growing tension with China. And we've seen that this week, where Obama was obliged to cancel a meeting with President Duterte because he was so insulting at the very moment when the Chinese were marshaling ships around the Scarborough Shoal. And may or may not be planning to do something there. It was vital. The key point of the U.S.-Philippine strategic relationship is defending that reef at the moment. I gather that Obama, by the way, ended up meeting with Duterte today, but thoughts about what do we do about the Philippines among these hard cases?
Well, I think at a minimum, I think canceling the meeting was the right call, both for the reasons that Duterte apparently didn't want to hear any criticism, but also his colorful approach to summit-level politics. But I think this has to be a message that the United States delivers publicly and not just privately when it comes to the Philippines, that we are manifestly uncomfortable with the extrajudicial killings that are taking place there. And we have walked the line in dealing with autocracies and democracies in our Philippine ally now for a very long time. And you can rewind the clock back to the Marcos regimes, and we threw Marcos sort of down and picked up the people power and Cory Aquino and everything else. There's a balance because they are an ally and they are in a contested part of the world, and we do value our relationship with them. But we would not be a good ally, and we would not be true to the alliance with the people of the Philippines if we were to remain silent about what is happening there now. So I think this is something that each time there is a meeting, certainly with Duterte, this has to be both on the public and the private agenda.
How good of an example are we setting? That's one of the questions. And Richard, you touched on that a little bit before. I mean, is it even possible for us to go talk to people about democracy after the election cycle we've been through? And how do we explain to other countries that are struggling with the question of whether they want to be democratic what's been going on here?
I mean, I think the answer is the standard answer that democracy is the worst of all systems except for all the alternatives, right? I mean, so yes, we're not sort of covering ourselves in glory for, the most principled and elevated presidential debate now, but would anybody in this room trade that for an autocracy? No. Well, why not? Well, explain.
When you can also say that the debate is happening out in the open, people aren't getting, killed or jailed for expressing these opinions. So it's being covered. We're debating different points of view, and ultimately the American people will decide. I mean, I've written on this and I've made an argument that it's not just this election cycle, it's also the fact that we have paralysis in the legislature that a lot of people would point to and say, but your system results in a lot of inaction. I mean, how often is legislation being passed? Are you able to really confront the major challenges that your country is facing? And would in a system where there's kind of a decision maker who can cut through all of that preferable? So I think it actually gives us an opportunity when we're doing this to be humble and to say, look, we're not, as the United States, coming and saying that we have it, perfect. Here are some of the challenges we face and some of the lessons. So maybe I think it's harmful overall, but it can also help in the sense that if we come at democracy promotion with a sense of humility and are upfront about our own challenges, maybe people will feel more open engaging in those conversations.
I think there's also some emblematic issues like Guantanamo high on the list where we're really being watched, and sort of the president's inability to make good on that promise after 8 years is kind of a stinging blemish on the human rights record as it's viewed from the rest of the world. That said, there has been a little bit of progress. I think that progress is crucial, and to continue that for the rest of the administration and into the next administration, so that is not permanent.
Question asks, what is the role of the private sector in supporting democratic systems and human rights? There hasn't been much of one, has there? And is there an opportunity there that we're missing?
So during my time at the White House, one of the things that we were trying to do was to get the private sector on board with the Stand with Civil Society agenda. We thought that that would be a reasonable entry point for the private sector because you can make a case that you need a vibrant, civil society, associational life, bar associations, trade unions, in order to have successful business ventures in these countries. So when the president did his second address on Stand with Civil Society, we actually went to the Clinton Foundation because we thought, we'll make our pledges using their sort of template, and that will be a way of attracting private sector interest and engagement and pledges in this area. There was not a single company who came on board with the agenda. And I think that's, again, because of the risks and the perception that they don't want to get embroiled in human rights and political issues. That said, I think there have been a couple of countries that have started, or a couple companies that have started to make this connection between, you want to have this vibrant civil society sector. It's important for their own business models. And so you do have some companies that are starting to sort of inch into this area. They're talking to civil society when it comes to making decisions about where they're going to put certain kinds of infrastructure. But I think it's really difficult. It's the same dilemma we're facing in terms of getting the private sector engaged in CVE. When there are alternatives for the private sector that seem to be less risky, like supporting education or healthcare or development, they tend to go in that direction.
And certainly, wholly apart from the potential for public-private partnerships, the decisions that corporations make can have a direct influence on all of the stuff we're talking about: freedom, human rights, democracy. Take the tech sector, for example. Tech companies can choose to sell products that aid in internet repression or not. They can sell surveillance equipment or not. They can censor results based on political criteria in autocratic government environments or not. The U.S. government doesn't really get very, very involved in that level of corporate decision making, but as an ever greater proportion of human activity is mediated through online communications technologies and more people go online, then that is a real issue. And I think, corporations are making the equivalent internally now what would otherwise be public policy decisions.
The important thing, too, to point out when it comes to civil society is that there is increasing evidence that there is collusion or at least shared objectives between some governments and corporations when it comes to suppressing civil society activity. So India comes to mind, where a lot of the backlash against civil society has been about civil society protesting investments that are being made in their communities that might result in the displacement of, of entire communities, or infrastructure that's being built. And because the Indian government has made economic growth and prosperity a signature part of its platform and its promises, there is a sense that civil society activists who are speaking out against that development or that investment are undermining national priorities. So in that sense, corporations have to be very sensitive to how the decisions that they're making in terms of investment are being treated and are being addressed, and whether the protests against those investments are being put down violently.
Yeah, I sort of wouldn't put the corporations and democracy promotion in the same sentence, because I think it's not sort of seen that way in the boardroom. I think their concerns are avoiding negative publicity of being associated with abuses, and I think we've had some progress, whether it's the Runge principles on corporate responsibility that were adopted at the UN about 5 years ago, and in industry-specific cases, pointing out the ways in which companies can be complicit in abuses and trying to expose that and get them to clean up their acts. The business principles for re-entry into Burma is one example. And I think the other piece is really charity, and what they can do as part of their kind of benign charitable agenda that can have the knock-on effect of augmenting civil society, whether it's in the health space or the education space, but kind of asking them to directly involve themselves in democracy promotion, I think, is just sort of a non-starter, and could also trigger a backlash as well.
Another subject I think we need to get into is that of American public opinion and American support for policies of supporting democracy and human rights. I think there's sort of the conventional wisdom, which I suppose is mostly true, that public support for U.S. democracy promotion, especially aggressive U.S. democracy promotion, has really declined in the last decade, mainly because of disillusionment about what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, was seen as failures, Libya. And I guess the question is, if you're somebody who thinks the U.S. government ought to be doing this, how do we combat that? Are we destined to 30 years of an Iraq syndrome in which nobody will ever want us to try and promote a democratic system in another country? Or is there a way to explain to people how we can make it work again?
I mean, I think part of it is to understand the relative importance or lack thereof of public opinion when it comes to this issue. I mean, if the president decided to bring up extrajudicial killings with Duterte, would there be a popular uprising in the United States and his success, it would be consequences of the next election? I think the answer is no. Now, if he wanted to do another Iraq, the answer would be yes, right? So, it's all, I think, in public opinion caught up, democracy means regime change and war and occupation and all these other things. Okay, well, don't do regime change and war and occupation for long periods of time and other things. You'll probably be okay. But I think you can still, even though that sentiment may be out there, you can still do all the stuff we talked about and not suffer any political consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is a need to kind of rebuild sort of the liberal case for staying engaged on these issues, because they have become associated with this, sort of imperialistic and kind of warmongering agenda, and we still haven't fully really lived that down. And I think there is a tolerance. People are kind of, they've gotten awfully comfortable sort of seeing what's unfolding in Syria. It's just been ongoing for so long, and there's a kind of numbness that has set in. I think there's a lack of confidence that these strategies really work, and that sort of contributes to what Richard was talking about, which is it barely sort of registers. So I think kind of on the left side, over the course of the next administration, building up a new intellectual argument about how the U.S. can go about this and deal with the backlash, the counter forces, and sort of what a strategy for the next decade or two would look like. I think that should be on the agenda.
Yeah, for me, it's making a clear linkage between support for democracy and human rights, and our national security. And I think there is evidence to make the case, and senior U.S. government officials regularly tout the talking point that our most reliable allies, our most stable allies are those countries that respect democratic principles, da, 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 da. So if we believe that and we truly embrace that, then we need to then say, well, then we need to be making decisions that result in greater investment in those values, not just as sort of the short-term, long-term trade-off, but because, building those reliable partnerships start today by trying to push those countries in the direction of reform and greater respect for human rights.
I think the challenge, and I think people would agree that those countries make better allies. I think the real question mark right now is, how you make a difference, and whether that pushing actually works,
results,
or may actually.
That's what I think is the thing too. I mean, I worry a little bit about drawing too close a linkage between, again, the Bush administration, the second term, the forward strategy for freedom was in part justified by democratic peace, right? Democracies don't go to war against each other. We have a manifest national interest beyond any values that may be at stake in promoting democracy around the world. And it was unclear how many people believed that or how much resonance this really had. And I think really the issue for skepticism, I would guess that most Americans in the abstract don't have to be convinced that human rights or lack of mass killings or repression or torture is, that those things are good. I don't think they have to be convinced on the merits by saying, well, there are also security benefits that stopping all those bad things generates. I think the issue is, can we be effective, and can we be effective at very low cost? Because if it means that we can only be effective by invading a country and occupying it or some variant thereof, we don't want to do it. And if we are going to spend even relatively small amounts of resources and be ineffective or just do what it seems to have done in Egypt and Pakistan and other places, make everybody mad, then keep us out of it.
I think one thing, to get back to something you said very early on, so there's the countries and the themes, and like the Obama administration has done, I think, really well on some of the themes. The LGBT, women's rights, digital freedom, sort of
accountability and governance and civil
atrocities. Maybe not atrocities, but but where they've kind of where it's been really difficult is sort of the hardest countries. But and I think that's how they're judged ultimately. And I think when you have a crisis like Syria, it kind of has a way of dwarfing whatever achievements you might have made on a thematic issue with incremental progress. Maybe across a dozen or two dozen countries. Where you have a few countries that are very visibly in a tailspin, or a Turkey or an Egypt, where we used to have influence and things have moved in the wrong direction and we seem to be incapable of doing anything about it. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think in some ways it's true that the themes are where there is a greater opportunity for U.S. leverage because it's less heavy-handed. We have been able to approach these things in a multilateral way. We can work with a range of different stakeholders, not just the government. And perhaps one of the answers to how we kind of elevate this issue in the public mind is, those issues do have real constituencies. Like on LGBT rights, one thing I noticed, and I didn't mention this as one of the accomplishments of the Human Rights Council, but that's the place where LGBT rights were first recognized as human rights, and now there's a global kind of rapporteur that's reporting regularly on abuses in that area. And it always gets a lot of press. Anything we did on the LGBT rights issue, I noticed always sort of got a lot of press and a lot of approval because it's an organized community that has a lot of media outlets, and there's just a lot of interest in those issues. That may be, one way of being able to demonstrate some progress and generate some public support for resources and attention in these areas.
The thing that's striking is that there's a distinction between regions, and Shannon sort of touched on this earlier. The one problem is we've spent the last decade working on the Middle East and failed sequentially in Iraq, Libya, Syria. There's this famous Obama administration cone that says, well, we tried invading and occupying Iraq, that didn't work. We tried, leading from behind in Libya, that didn't work. We tried doing nothing in Syria, that doesn't work. Therefore, nothing works, and the U.S. can't do anything. And yet, we've forgotten about what happened in the 1990s, where we successfully promoted democracy with U.S. leverage across Central and Eastern Europe. We stopped a war and a genocide in Bosnia belatedly, but we did stop it. We had other interventions that were relatively successful in Haiti, Somalia, elsewhere. Can we somehow revive the idea that it's actually possible for the U.S. to use its leverage and actually accomplish something, at least outside the Middle East?
Yeah, I think that gets to this effectiveness thing, and I think a key part of the message is examples. Examples you gave, but also the examples in Asia in the 1970s and the 1980s. I mean, ask Kim Dae-jung, who was a Korean dissident who would have been executed at sea and thrown into the water, but for the last-minute intervention of the United States, who then went on to be president of the country. Ask the folks in the Philippines, not Duterte, ask others, about American support. After a long period of some, hand-wringing about support for people power in Corea Aquino and everything that happened there, Taiwan. I mean, you can go around that region as well, not to mention the Western Hemisphere, which a lot of these cases are complicated. There are multiple forces, but the United States has been a force for good in a lot of these cases, and I think a lot of them have retreated into memory or less, because what is in front of our faces are the failures of the biggest democracy building projects in the world, which have been Iraq and Afghanistan.
I think it's also kind of a generational problem, because you have sort of people, foreign policy professionals, who kind of came of age in the 90s with this sense that we could do good things around the world, and we kind of seemed to happen or been part of it. I think now you have a generation, now over kind of 16 years where it's been so difficult, and there is a sense that just as often it's going to backfire, or we've tried everything and nothing works. And so how I do think that's an essential piece for the next administration, kind of trying to instill in the new generation this sense of possibility. And there's some examples of it. I think Burma is a good one, where it really was not clear that there was going to be any progress or any opening there, and even though it's problematic, it's 1,000 times better than it was, and it's a kind of open society to some degree now, with many problems and shortcomings, but a pretty dramatic transformation in which the U.S. played a signature role. So I think it is important not to get demoralized, and to remember these examples, and to think about how we're sort of rearing up the next generation, whether it's foreign service officers or sort of political appointees who are in the think tanks now.
So just don't hire millennials. Just go with who cut their teeth in the 90s or before, when we could do this.
Well, not to sound like a broken record, though, but I think it does go back to how we think about our leverage. Senator Cardin talked about a bill where they would, condition development assistance on whether or not they're making progress on corruption. But oftentimes that development assistance pales in comparison to assistance from DoD or intelligence cooperation. So where there have been a few cases, and again, these aren't the hardest countries, but periods of time in Uganda or Sri Lanka or elsewhere where we put all of the assistance on the table and decided how we can use the leverage that we have as a U.S. government, we have been able to get, some degree of progress. But oftentimes that's not the case. You talk about withdrawing some, $30 million of development assistance, as if that's going to send, a really strong message, when you're carrying on with, security cooperation that's, magnitudes more than that. So I think if we think about our leverage holistically, and we're really willing to put all of those cards on the table and think about which ones we can use to maybe have some progress, that would be a better model. It's not going to work all the time. The environment now is much more difficult than it was in the 90s, when the wind was sort of in the sails of democracy promoters. But I do think that we're selling ourselves short when we're just looking at one aspect of leverage.
I think that's a good place to stop, and we're